Let's start with that right now with our next guest, KT McFarland. KT, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Look, there was this ruling from an appeals court judge here in the District of Columbia that said, you know what, the NSA's practice of capturing PIN data, that's just basically the phone number and who you called, and storing it in a big database for every American and every domestic phone call that is made in this country, putting it in a big database, but then agreeing not to go there and look at it unless they had a national security concern. Well, this federal appeals court said, you know what, that it may be a violation of the Fourth Amendment constitutional rights of all Americans. It may be too broad. On the other hand, you know, you got the NSA, and I know that, you know, you have a great, healthy respect for what they do out there, as I do as well. I know some people that work out there, and they're great Americans. But, I mean, do you have any concerns about the breadth and the depth and the scope of what they're doing?
Yeah, and I've come actually full circle on it. You know, when the stories first came out, I thought, well, the NSA, they're just doing their job, keeping us safe from terrorist attacks, and I think they are. And that the critics of it, well, they're just the kind of people who always criticize stuff like that. You know, the political correctness crowd, the guys who fail to appreciate the threats we face. They don't understand how hard it is to find the needle in the haystack. But I must say, having talked to people in the intelligence community who explained, you know, what you said, the metadata collection, it vacuums everything up, and the only time you actually go look at the phone calls is when there's probable cause. I talked to a senior official of the NSA who explained what they did. But, you know, the more and more I hear of it, I just, what's to prevent anybody from abusing that?
Yeah.
And looking at the content of what political adversaries are doing. I never would have thought it would happen, but then I never thought you'd see the FBI wiretapping reporters.
Well, you know,
or the IRS persecuting
go.
conservative groups. Those abuses of power do happen.
And let me follow up, because we would not know about any of this were it not for Edward Snowden.
Yeah, and if the example is that the NSA says, well, we only have a few really trusted people who have access to this information, well, who is Edward Snowden? How is he able to sort of scoop everything up and hightail it out of town? Look, I don't think Edward Snowden is a hero. I think if he really was a good and honorable whistleblower and patriot, he should have taken that information not to the Chinese and not to the Russians. He should have taken it to a member of Congress. He would have had whistleblower protection, and there are plenty of members of Congress who would have loved to trumpet this issue and to take the national discussion that we are now having and do it within the confines of the United States. So I'm not a Snowden fan, but I think that he has ripped open, you know, pulled back the veil on what's going on, and I find it upsetting. Look, I worked in the Nixon administration during Watergate, and although I was not wiretapped, several of my colleagues were wiretapped because it was thought they were leaking information to the press about the Vietnam War. I thought that if the wiretap, they thought those wiretaps were justified because people's lives were at stake. They were fighting for our country. And yet that wiretapping, as much as I thought it was okay, it was one of the charges in the impeachment case against Nixon, who later was forced to resign. So I've come full circle around and say, I understand that they're not abusing power, but they're setting the system up so that somebody who comes down the road later can abuse power, and that makes me very nervous. If the enemies list, what is to prevent these guys from having that power in the hands of political leaders who decide they want to investigate who their political opponents are talking to? Now, I know the system...
Next thing you know, they'll use the IRS to put pressure on groups
and
like
the problem is that they have.
Right.
Yeah, right.
If we didn't have the IRS thing, if we didn't have the FBI wiretapping thing, then I would probably feel differently. But I don't, because it is seen that this now, government is a tool, a political tool that political leaders can use. And that makes me much more nervous than anything else.
And that's why, to be consistent, you have to condemn the policy, because you can't just say, well, this policy is fine as long as the guy who sits in the Oval Office is okay, because you can never trust that the guy that sits in the Oval Office. That's the whole point of citizens keeping an eye on the government, as our founders wanted it to be. Hey, KT, can I, keeping along this Edward Snowden strain, because I understand your position on him, but what happened yesterday, he's now sent an open letter to the nation of Brazil. He'd love to trade Moscow for Rio, and who wouldn't? But Brazil...
Getting pretty cold there this winter, isn't it?
So Brazil is very, very concerned about the United States and the NSA program and whether there's been any spying in Brazil. He's now saying, listen, I'll help your investigation. I've got some info for you if you give me asylum in Brazil. What should the United States government do about this? Because Brazil is a whole lot different than Russia.
Yeah, and I think that Snowden is an unguided missile and a loose cannon, or whatever expression you want to use for him. I do not think he's a great American patriot. Interestingly, I was with a senior Russian leader this week, and we talked about Snowden, and he said, look, we didn't know he wasn't our plant in the NSA. We didn't even know he was coming to Moscow until he was already on the plane. And we would have, if it had been kept quiet, we could have dealt with it. He said, but the fact that the president and the United States made such a big deal out of it, and President Obama said, you got to give him back right now, it sort of put the Russians in this position. Now, I don't necessarily believe what this Russian senior leader told me, but I thought it was a fascinating thing that it was all about ego and macho and appearances that they responded the way they did.
Hey, KT, we only have a minute, but you know a lot about China.
Right.
What do you make of the latest actions and the near miss with the ships?
When your children keep coming to you and sort of pushing to see where's the end of how far can they get, how much can they do before they get pushed back, I think that's what the Chinese are doing. They feel that they've got a strong economy. They're the world's oldest civilization. It's time for them to flex their muscles, and they're looking at the East China Sea, South China Sea, is sort of the way we look at Lake Michigan. And I don't think we should let them.
Yeah, and I understand what you're saying. In other words, it belongs to Michigan, and Illinois and Wisconsin should keep their mitts off of that.
Yeah. All right, KT, thank you so much. Always a pleasure.
Merry Christmas, KT.